Controversial Questions. Video Lecture. Argumentation and the Existence of God. Part 1. Argumentation. In this part of the video, we're going to ask, what is an argument and how do we evaluate it? Now, a lot of times when we think of the word argument, we probably think of two people, very angry, yelling at each other, raising voices, not overly happy with the other person, probably not listening to what the other person is saying, but feeling very confident in their own viewpoint. That's not exactly what we mean when we talk about an argument in philosophy. An argument is a structured rationale offered to demonstrate the truthfulness of a proposition. Let's break this down by looking at the structure of an argument. In order to understand or appreciate the structure of an argument, we have to have some terminology. First, a proposition. A proposition's just a statement that has a truth value. Consider the statement, "It's raining outside my house." This statement is either true or false, and we can actually evaluate whether it's true or false. That makes it a proposition. On the other hand, the statement, "Green is the bestest of all colors," well, it's not really subject to truth statements or truth values. It's an opinion. A proposition has to have a truth value. Now, every argument is composed in part of a premise or premises, and this is simply a proposition that is intended to demonstrate the truth of a conclusion. And as you can imagine, the next term we're going to discuss is conclusion, which is the proposition one is trying to demonstrate or prove. Having these ideas in place, let's take a look at a particular argument. This is Steve. Steve looks like he's having a pretty good time. We're going to make three statements here. First, all birds fly. Steve is flying, so Steve is a bird. All three of these statements are propositions, meaning they're all either true or false. The first two statements are the premises of this particular argument. They're set up in such a way to demonstrate the conclusion. We know this is the conclusion because of the word so. That is, all birds fly, Steve is flying, are meant to demonstrate the truthfulness that Steve is a bird. Let's talk about three different kinds of arguments. The three main categories of arguments are deductive, inductive, and abductive. We're going to focus on the deductive argument for right now. In a deductive argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed. Our argument about Steve being a bird is a deductive argument, because the conclusion is offered as a fact following from the premises. So how do we evaluate a deductive argument? Well, we can ask two fundamental questions of deductive arguments. We could first ask, is the argument valid? Well, what does that mean? An argument is valid when its premises lead to its conclusion. That is, the premises demonstrate that the conclusion is true. If it is valid, we can ask, is the argument sound? What does this mean? An argument is sound when its premises lead to its conclusion and its premises are true. To help understand this a little bit better, let's return to our previous argument. All birds fly, Steve is flying, so Steve is a bird. Now, obviously this argument is terrible. We know it doesn't work. Do we know why it doesn't work, though? Well, let's evaluate it. First, is the argument valid? That is, do its premises lead to its conclusion? Well, the two premises are, all birds fly, Steve is flying. The conclusion, Steve is a bird. Let's assume for a moment that the premises are true. Let's assume that all birds do fly. Let's also assume that Steve is flying. Would it follow then that Steve is a bird? Well, no, it wouldn't. Because even if all birds fly, it doesn't mean that everything that's flying is a bird. Similarly, we might say, all poodles are dogs. But it doesn't follow that all dogs are poodles. There's lots of different kinds of dogs. Scary dogs, yippy dogs, happy Labrador dogs. Just like all poodles being dogs doesn't mean all dogs are poodles, so all birds flying doesn't mean that everyone that flies or everything that flies is a bird. Is the argument sound? Let's assume that the premises do lead to the conclusion. We still have to ask, are the premises true? Well, let's take them one at a time. First, premise 1 says, all birds fly. Now we do know that some birds fly. Consider the majestic eagle. However, there are other birds, known as flightless birds, who don't fly. For example, the penguin has wings, but doesn't fly. Oh, whoa! Language. Jeez. Sorry, everybody. Anyway, premise 2 states that Steve is flying. Now, this one's tricky. Steve might be flying. We don't really know for sure. I mean, it's also possible, and given what we know about humans, more likely, that Steve is hurtling toward the ground, about to face his own death. At any rate, we'd have to investigate the premise further in order to establish its truthfulness. So let's look at the argument. All birds fly? No, that's not true. Steve is flying. Well, we don't really know if that's true or not. However, we could probably guess that it's not true given what we know about human beings. So, Steve is a bird. Look, obviously this argument is terrible, and you should be angry at me that I've been talking about it for so long, and angry at yourself that you've been listening to me talk about it for so long. But it's important to note that even though the argument is crap, the conclusion Steve is a bird is not necessarily false. All that we know is that it's not demonstrated by the argument. So why is that important? Well, it's important because it means that even if an argument is invalid or unsound, it is still possible that the conclusion is true. Let's look at an example to make sense of this. Some U.S. presidents had a beard. Abraham Lincoln was a U.S. president. Abraham Lincoln had a beard. Now, it is true that some U.S. presidents had a beard. It's also true that Abraham Lincoln was a U.S. president. But because it's possible that Abraham Lincoln was a U.S. president who didn't have a beard, the argument is invalid. That is, the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. But even though the argument is invalid, we do know, historically, that Abraham Lincoln did have a beard. Oh my God, look at that's like a zombie Abraham Lincoln. Jeez. Anyway, the point is that the conclusion Abraham Lincoln had a beard is true, it just doesn't follow from the premises. So let's take an example of a good deductive argument. What would that look like? We've looked at some bad ones. How about a good one? All chinchillas are rodents. Choopy is a chinchilla. Choopy is a rodent. Is this argument valid? Well, yes it is. After all, if all chinchillas are rodents, and Choopy is a chinchilla, it would follow necessarily that Choopy is a rodent. The argument is valid. Thumbs up. But the question still remains, is the argument sound? It's only sound if it is true that all chinchillas are rodents and Choopy is a chinchilla. And it just so happens that these are true. Here's a picture of me with my chinchilla, Choopy. So the argument is in fact sound because the premises lead to the conclusion and the premises are true. By the way, Choopy died a few years ago, made me very sad. There's other types of arguments we should discuss as well. Let's consider the inductive argument. In an inductive argument, the premises do not guarantee the conclusion, but they provide legitimate evidence that the conclusion is probably true. So, the sun rises every morning. The sun will rise tomorrow morning. It's reasonable to assume the sun will rise tomorrow morning because it's risen every morning that we know of, at least as long as the Earth has existed. We can talk about the strength of an inductive argument when evaluating it. Inductive arguments are evaluated on a scale between strong and weak. Is that Santa without a shirt deadlifting? I don't even know what's happening anymore. Anyway, inductive arguments are evaluated on a scale between strong and weak. So how do we differentiate between the two? Let's use two arguments as an example. First, Every human I've learned about in history has died. Every human my friends and family have learned about in history has died. So, every human will die. Here's another argument. Every time I'm around dogs, I sneeze. So, every human must be allergic to dogs. In the first example, if the premises are true, it seems probable that the conclusion is also true. That is, if every human we know about has in fact died, it seems reasonable to assume that every human will die. Because of this argument is a strong inductive argument, not guaranteed, but very probable. The other argument, the conclusion that everyone must be allergic to dogs simply because I sneeze, well, it doesn't follow from this premise. It's possible that I could be allergic to dogs, but no one else would be, or at least not everyone else would be. And so this is a weak inductive argument. It doesn't seem like the conclusion follows from the premise. We can also ask if an inductive argument is cogent. An inductive argument is cogent if it is strong and its premises are true. Let's return to our example of the sun. That sun has a face. Anyway, if the sun does rise every day and has risen every day, it seems very reasonable to assume it will rise tomorrow. And in fact, we know the sun has risen every day. So this is a strong and also cogent inductive argument. That is creepy. There's also an abductive argument. In this argument, the premises are incomplete and inconclusive, but the conclusion is the best educated guess given the information available. Again, an example. Let's say this morning I found my lawn chair knocked over. Aw, that's sad. Let's say I also know that it was extremely windy last night. I could reasonably conclude that the wind knocked over my lawn chair. It's not guaranteed. There's more evidence that could prove this wrong. A kid came and knocked it over. But it seems a reasonable or the best conclusion given the evidence we have currently, even though that evidence is incomplete. Let's turn our focus now to our question. Does God exist? I always like to draw God as a balloon. I have my reasons, and they're super awesome. Nonetheless, whenever you see a balloon in this video, you can assume that it's referring to God. So, does God exist? A fair question. Let's say somebody makes the argument, I have personally experienced God. Ah, there God is, see? Because I've experienced God, I conclude, therefore, God exists. The premise here is I have personally experienced God. The conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Now let's say somebody intends this argument as a deductive argument. If that were the case, there would be an implied premise, which is, my personal experiences are always reliable sources of truth. So let's ask if the argument is valid. Well, it seems that it is. After all, if your personal experiences are always reliable sources of truth, and you have experienced God, it seems that God does in fact exist. But when the question asks, is the argument sound, it's a bit of a different story. Firstly, we don't really know if you've experienced God or not. That's your claim, that's your interpretation of your experience, but we don't really have any knowledge of that. But the idea that your personal experiences are always reliable sources of truth seems demonstrably false. After all, we all misinterpret reality from time to time. Therefore, because all the premises are not true, the argument is not sound. Now again, it doesn't follow that God does not exist, it just follows that this argument doesn't prove it. But what if we offered an inductive or abductive argument here? That is, what if we said, I have experienced God, therefore God exists, not deductively, but inductively? Even here, the argument doesn't seem very strong, because the argument doesn't take into account all the relevant data, the experiences of other people, other sources of reality, other claims about human experience. Again, it doesn't follow that God does not exist. It just follows that these arguments for God, based on one's personal experience, don't prove or demonstrate that God exists. We did, however, encounter other arguments and deductive arguments for the existence of God, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the teleological argument. The point of this video is not to go through these arguments individually. It is merely to suggest how we could go about understanding what an argument is and how we might evaluate that argument. In order to do so, we need to first understand, is the argument deductive, inductive, or abductive? If it's deductive, we can evaluate, is it valid, and then is it sound? If it's not valid, it's a bad argument. If it's valid but not sound, it doesn't demonstrate the conclusion. If it's an inductive argument, we can evaluate, is it weak or strong? If it seems that the conclusion follows or probably follows from the premises, it's strong. Of course, this is not an either or, but rather a scale from weak to strong. If it is strong, we can then ask, is the argument cogent? The argument is cogent if the premises are true. And then we can say it's very probable that the conclusion is true, given that the premises are true and the conclusion likely follows from the premises. With abductive arguments, it's much more complicated. We can make the best guess given the evidence we have, but we always have to be open to more evidence coming forward and then completely revisiting, rehashing, changing our conclusion based on that new evidence. At least this gives us a point of departure that we can begin to evaluate not only arguments for the existence of God, but all kinds of arguments that are put forth about all different kinds of things. I hope you found this video helpful. Thank you.